Welkom terug. Nou sommer so op Wêreldreënwouddag 'n baie toepaslike onderhoud. Ons gesels met Dr. Neville Sweijd van die Alliance for Collaboration in Climate and Earth Systems Science, of ACCESS verkort. Ons kyk vanoggend saam met mekaar om basies te gesels oor El Niño, om te kyk wat die huidige stelsel doen en hoe dit werk. Good morning, Dr. Neville.
Morning, everybody. Thanks very much for having me.
It's lovely having you on the show this morning. Doctor, please, just for some background, just tell us a little more about El Niño, just as a recap. What is El Niño?
Okay, so El Niño is a phenomenon that happens in the Pacific Ocean. It's something that happens really over the whole extent of the ocean, and there are different states. One of those states is the El Niño, and the other is the La Niña. Those are the two extreme states. And basically what this means is when the trade winds either blow stronger than normal or weaker than normal, we move from one state to the other. And essentially what happens is the temperature of the sea surface off the coast of South America, as you can see on the top right, gets cooler than normal during the La Niña season. And in an El Niño season, which is the one at the bottom, which we're experiencing now, the sea surface temperature gets much warmer than normal. And this varies. Sometimes it's strong, sometimes it's a weak system, but it oscillates between these two different kinds of states. And so they're really two states of the same process. We call that ENSO, or the El Niño Southern Oscillation. Interestingly, the La Niña was named by a South African scientist who came from Cape Town and is now living in the United States. So that's what it really is. It's a phenomenon in the Pacific. But what's really important to understand is it's huge. And so its influence on global weather is felt pretty much everywhere in the world. It's not the only system like that. We call it a dipole. There are others like the Indian Ocean dipole, the Southern mode, and there are some other systems, but it's the biggest and therefore the most powerful in terms of its influence on weather around the world.
How often does this occur?
Well, it's really unpredictable. It used to occur one state or the other. We used to have, they used to say El Niño once a decade, but it's actually been happening relatively more frequently, at least the variability, in other words, the change of state has been happening relatively more frequently. And in fact, some published science is showing that the frequency of this extreme state is set to increase with global warming. Excuse me. So it's important to note that it's a natural phenomenon, but the strength of the signal and the frequency of it moving to one extreme or another is trending. So it happens quite unpredictably, but at least once a decade, if not more.
Doc, what's the effects that it has on South Africa? If for the everyday guy in the street, how do we experience it?
Okay, so we've been in a La Niña state for the last 3 years, and now we're moving from a La Niña into a El Niño state. And you might recall that we've had some fairly heavy rainfall in the north, in the summer rainfall areas of South Africa. We've had some fairly abnormal rain, leading to some flooding in some areas. So in general, the La Niña state is associated with above normal rainfall. This, what you're looking at now, is an image from the 2015-16 El Niño for 3 months rainfall, cumulative rainfall over the country. And you can see the darker areas are showing what are drought areas, meaning much less rainfall than average. This is not always the case, but generally speaking, an El Niño leads to drier than normal conditions and sometimes to drought. Most of our big droughts that we've had over the summer rainfall area in the summer season have been associated with El Niños, but not all. And it's important to note that not all El Niños have the impact and the strength of the El Nino doesn't always linearly translate into that kind of impact on the country. But in general, drier and hotter conditions than normal during an El Nino.
Doc Neville, the weather we're experiencing specifically in the Cape now, the extreme winds, the rain, is it something out of the ordinary?
Well, it has to be said that the rainfall we're experiencing and the winter storms we're experiencing in the Western Cape are unusual, and extreme, indeed extreme, but not unheard of. So we do see long-term cycles in some weather patterns. This year, the rain has come relatively early and in abundance, which is something, of course, we should be grateful for. And what's important to note is that the weather is, the seasons are always different from each other. No seasons are really the same. And as we like to say, climate is the average of weather. So it's very difficult to tell whether this particular experience is special. And you'll recall just a few years ago, we had a failure of the winter rains, which was another kind of extreme on the other side.
Yes.
So it's very hard to say. What we do know in general is that with climate change, it's predicted that the variability, in other words, the extremes on all sides of weather are set to change. And another point to mention is that cold fronts which bring the rainfall to the Western Cape are always present. During the summer months, they generally go further south of the country and don't make landfall. But during the winter months, the system generally moves north, and so these cold fronts make landfall. So it's not unusual to have this kind of rain. What is unusual, excuse me again, what is unusual is to have it so early in the winter. It's interesting to note, though, that historically June is our wettest month, although usually a bit later in June. So it's definitely extreme, but not off the charts unusual.
It's sometimes a little difficult for the average Joe to take in all the climate information. Like you said now, climate is the average of weather. And there's so many sources of information and data that I think even for scientists at some stage it becomes a jumble. Tell us, how do you focus on where all these data sources meet, and where do they get together, and where do you make sense? How do you make sense of it all?
That's a great question. First of all, I need to say that there's a lot of information and understanding still to be had. For example, we know that there's a relationship between the ENSO, El Nino and La Nina, and generally weather in Southern Africa. We're not absolutely certain how that works. We have some theories about how that works. And in order for us to really understand it, we need scientists to do the research. And indeed, there is a lot of information out there. You'll see the logos around me, the CSIR, the Agricultural Research Council, several of the universities, the South African Weather Service. All of us are collecting data, and there's a lot of international data from various programs. And what is in fact happening is we are getting more and more organized, but a lot of the research really does take place under the behest of interest of the various scientists. Generally, we go after big events to try and understand the day zero drought, some of these big features like the El Nino, and of course, and climate change. But there is an effort to put together a program which is really called Climate Services. And that is designed to coordinate all of the observations so that we can bring the right climate information at the right space and time scales to various users, such as in health and in transport and in other sectors. So there's a lot of information, there's a lot of observations and a lot of models, and indeed there's a big effort to coordinate that.
Well, thank you very much for making it a little clearer for us this morning and telling us more about El Nino and La Nina. Thank you very much, Dr. Neville Sweijd. Nou ja, daar het jy dit, né? Sien jy Die slim mense weet. Mense moet net met hulle gesels. Nou ja, dit was dan Dr. Neville Sweijd van die Alliance for Collaboration in Climate and Earth System Science, of ACCESS verkort. As ons terugkom, is dit tyd vir die nuus en, jy sal dit nie raai nie, die weer.